It arrived on a Tuesday. I remember that detail because Tuesdays were mine. I had made them mine deliberately, the day I reserved for quiet, for the small rituals that had taken me 2 years to build. Coffee before anything. The window open a crack. Nothing in the morning that asked too much of me. I was not expecting mail. And then there it was, a single envelope on the table where my neighbor had left it, slipped under my door sometime that morning. The return address was a law firm. The city printed beneath it was one I recognized immediately. I had not heard from anyone connected to that city in 2 years. I set my coffee down. I picked up the envelope. And I read it slowly, the way you read something when you already know it is going to matter. When I finished, I set it down on the table. And I smiled. Not a triumphant smile. Not the smile of someone who had been waiting for a fight. It was the quiet smile of someone who had been waiting for a confirmation and had just received it. They thought 2 years of silence meant I had done nothing. They were wrong about that. They had been wrong about that for a very long time. Before I take you back to the beginning of the story, drop your city and the time below. I genuinely love knowing where you are when you're listening. And if you haven't subscribed yet, please do. This story takes a little while to build. But I promise you, it earns every minute. Let me take you back to the day I understood that going quiet was the most powerful thing I would ever do. I grew up in a house where there was order, but not warmth. Enough, but never ease. My parents, Gerald and Patricia, were not unkind in any obvious way. They did not shout. They did not disappear. What they did, with remarkable consistency over the course of my entire childhood, was simply not quite see me. There were 3 of us. My brother Daniel was the eldest. Steady, focused, the kind of son who filled a room in a way my parents understood. My sister Claire was younger than me by 3 years, bright-eyed, quick to laugh, easy to love. She moved through the family like light through a window. And then there was me, Mara, the middle one. The one who read too much, asked too many questions, noticed things that were better left unnoticed. I do not say this bitterly. I say it because it is true, and because it took me a long time to see it clearly. The moments that taught me where I stood were never the large ones. They were small. The kind you almost talk yourself out of mentioning. When Daniel was accepted to university, my father opened a bottle of wine he had been saving. The table was full that night. There were toasts. When I graduated at the top of my class 2 years later, my mother made pasta. It was good pasta. We ate it at the kitchen table. No one opened anything. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that for a long time. My grandmother lived 40 minutes away, in the house she had owned since before my parents were married. A small white house at the end of a road with old oaks on both sides. It smelled like cedar and good coffee and the faint sweetness of whatever she had baked that morning. She was my father's mother, which meant she had watched him become who he was. She knew, I think, more than she ever said. When I was with her, I was simply Mara. Not the middle one. Not the one who asked too many questions. Just Mara. Someone worth knowing. She had a way of listening that made you feel the entire room had gone still for you. I visited her every few weeks for most of my adult life. We would sit at her kitchen table the same way I now sit at mine. Coffee. A window. Nothing that asked too much. Once, when I was about 32, she said something I didn't fully understand at the time. She had been quiet for a while. She set down her cup, looked out the window at the oak trees and said, "I've been thinking about what to leave behind, Mara. Not just things. Intentions. There's a difference, you know. Things can be taken. Intentions, if you write them carefully, those hold." I thought she was being philosophical. The way she sometimes was. I didn't understand what she meant until much later. What pushed things to the point of no return was not one single moment. It rarely is. It was a series of small moments that finally accumulated into something I could not carry any further. But if I had to point to the day, the specific afternoon when I understood that something had permanently shifted, it would be the day of my cousin Rachel's engagement party, 2.5 years ago. It was held at my parents' house. My mother had spent weeks preparing. The backyard was arranged perfectly. There were flowers. There was a caterer. There were 60 people who had come to celebrate. I arrived on time. I found a seat at one of the smaller tables toward the back. And I watched. I watched my parents move through that party like people who were entirely at ease with the world they had built. My mother refilled glasses and touched shoulders and laughed. My father stood near the center of things, the way he always had. At some point in the afternoon, my father gave a toast. He talked about family. He talked about legacy. He said the word love several times. He mentioned Daniel by name. He mentioned Claire by name. He mentioned Rachel, of course. He did not mention me. I sat there for a moment after he finished. Everyone was applauding. My glass was still full. I thought, he forgot. It was an accident. There were a lot of people. He had a lot to remember. But then my mother caught my eye from across the yard. And she did not look apologetic. She looked satisfied. Like something had gone exactly as planned. I set my glass down on the table. I picked up my bag. I walked to my car. I drove home. I did not call them that night. I did not call them the next day. By the end of that week, something in me had quietly decided. I was done waiting to be seen. When I finally told them I needed space, I kept it brief. I said I thought some distance would be good for all of us. I said I would be in touch when I was ready. What I didn't tell them was that I had already started keeping records. What my parents didn't know was that my grandmother, the woman they had always treated as merely sentimental, had spent the last 18 months of her life being very, very precise. People imagine no contact as dramatic, as doors slamming, as long tearful confrontations, as some decisive final scene. It wasn't like that. It was ordinary. Quietly, surprisingly ordinary. The calls I used to dread stopped coming. The Sunday obligations that had drained me for years gone. There was just space. Clean and a little disorienting at first, like a room with too much furniture finally cleared out. I want to be honest with you about this, because I think people expect a different story. They expect grief and doubt and sleepless nights of wondering if they made the right choice. There was grief. But it wasn't for the parents I had. It was for the ones I had spent a lifetime hoping they might become. That grief was real. And then, slowly, it settled. I missed the family I had wanted them to be. I did not miss the family they actually were. I kept visiting my grandmother. This matters. I want you to understand that I didn't visit her because I was planning anything. I visited her because she was my grandmother, and she was getting older, and I loved her. It was that simple. But in those visits, something was being quietly built. She would ask me to stay for dinner. She would talk. And sometimes, she would say things that only made sense later. About 6 months into my no contact, she asked me to meet someone. A friend of mine, she said. A lawyer. Someone I trust. I just want you to sit with her for an hour. You don't have to do anything. Just listen. Her name was Margaret. She was in her 60s, quiet-spoken, with a kind of stillness that suggested she had seen most things and was not easily rattled. We sat in my grandmother's living room and talked for almost 2 hours. By the end of it, I understood that my grandmother had already begun the process of making sure certain things were protected, and that she wanted me to understand what that meant, legally, clearly, without anyone else in the room. I also began keeping records of my own. Every visit to my grandmother was logged. Dates, times, what we discussed. Not because anything felt wrong, but because Margaret had gently suggested it. If anyone ever questions her capacity or your relationship, she said, you want a record that looks like what it actually is. A granddaughter who showed up. So I showed up. And I wrote it down. Then, about a year into the silence, my grandmother handed me a sealed envelope. She pressed it into my hands the way you hand someone something fragile. For later, she said. When you'll know what to do with it. Don't open it yet. Just keep it somewhere safe. I kept it in the small cedar box she had given me years before. The one that sat on the shelf in my bedroom. I didn't open it. I didn't open it for a very long time. My grandmother passed in the autumn of the 2nd year. I was with her near the end. We sat in her room at the hospital, and the light came through the window the way it does in October, thin and gold. She was tired, but she was herself. She held my hand and said things I am not going to repeat here, because they were only for me. I drove home that night and sat in my car in the driveway for a long time. The funeral was a week later. My parents were there. We were in the same building for the first time in nearly 2 years. We did not speak. I sat in the third row. They sat in the first. The distance between us felt structural rather than accidental. After the service, my cousin Rachel found me by the door and held my hand without saying anything. That meant more than most words would have. The will was read the following week at Margaret's office. I sat across the table from her, and she read it plainly. My grandmother had left me the house. The one with the old oaks. The one that smelled like cedar and good coffee. She had left other assets to other family members. She had been fair in the way she measured fairness, which was not by equal division, but by what she believed had been earned. My parents were at that reading. My father sat very still. My mother's hands were flat on her thighs. No one said anything. Not yet. I drove home from Margaret's office that day thinking about what my grandmother had said about intentions. About the difference between things that can be taken and things that hold. She had spent 2 years making sure I understood the difference. And so had I.So. The Tuesday. The envelope. The return address I recognized. I made coffee first. I want you to know that. I did not tear it open in the hallway or read it standing up. I set it on the table, made my coffee, opened the window the usual crack, and sat down. Then I opened it. It was 4 pages. Formal. The kind of language that is designed to feel larger than it is, dense with terms and clauses, written to intimidate the person it's addressed to. The summary was this. My parents' attorney was writing to inform me that my parents intended to contest my grandmother's will. Their grounds were twofold. First, they claimed my grandmother had been of diminished mental capacity in the period leading up to the will's signing, and therefore not legally competent to make the decisions reflected in the document. Second, they alleged that I had exercised undue influence over her, that I had used my access to her in her final years to manipulate a vulnerable elderly woman into leaving me an asset that should, by their reasoning, have been distributed differently. There was a demand near the end of the letter. They were requesting that I agree to enter mediation. If I declined, they would proceed with a formal contest. The letter was signed by an attorney I had never heard of at a firm I did not recognize. I read it twice. Slowly, both times. I set it down on the table. And I smiled. Not because I was glad they had done this. Not because I wanted a legal battle. But because I had a sealed envelope sitting in a cedar box on my bedroom shelf, and a 2-year record of visits sitting in a folder in my desk drawer, and a lawyer who had been quietly anticipating exactly this moment. They had assumed the silence meant I had done nothing. They had sent a letter designed for someone unprepared. They had no idea who they were writing to. I finished my coffee. Then I picked up my phone and called one number. Margaret answered on the second ring. I told her what the letter said. There was a brief pause. Then she said, in the same calm voice she had used the first day I met her in my grandmother's living room. We expected this. Here's what we do now. If you've ever had someone underestimate you so completely that you almost felt sorry for them, you know what that phone call felt like. Drop a comment below. I love reading them. When a will enters probate, there are steps that happen automatically. Documents are filed. The estate enters a legal process that has its own structure, its own timeline. What my parents' attorney didn't know was that Margaret had already filed a protective caveat when the will was probated, a formal legal notice indicating that the will might be subject to challenge, and that certain evidentiary protections were in place. This is not unusual. But it meant that any challenge my parents now filed would encounter something they were not expecting, a response that was already organized, already documented, and already waiting for them. They've done you a favor, Margaret told me that morning on the phone. By filing a formal contest, they've triggered a discovery process. That means we get to ask for their financial records. She let that sit for a moment. All of them. That afternoon, I went in my bedroom shelf and took down the cedar box. I opened it for the first time since my grandmother had handed it to me. Inside was the envelope, exactly as it had been. Her handwriting on the front. My name. Nothing else. I sat on the edge of my bed and opened it. It was 6 pages. Her handwriting throughout, steady, careful, the handwriting of someone who had taken their time. She began by explaining the letter's purpose. She had written it, she said, because she understood what was likely to happen after she was gone, and she wanted to be on record about several things. She wrote about her own mind. She wrote with the kind of clarity and self-awareness that is almost disarming in its directness. She named the date. She described her own health as she understood it at the time of writing. She noted that she had met with her physician the previous month, that her cognition had been assessed as normal for her age, and that she was making this record while she was well and while she was certain. "I am writing this," she said, "because I know that what I've decided will upset some people. And I know that when people are upset, they reach for the easiest explanation they can find. I am not confused. I am not being influenced. I am simply a woman who has watched her family for 78 years and who has decided, on the basis of that watching, what is right." She wrote about me. Not in a way that felt defensive or constructed, but in the way she had always spoken to me directly. She wrote about the years of visits. She wrote about what she had observed of my character. She wrote that she had made her decision freely, that she had made it before I was ever in no contact with my parents, that the decision had nothing to do with taking sides, and everything to do with fairness as she understood it. And then she wrote something that stopped me completely. She wrote that over the years, my parents had borrowed from her. Not once, several times. Significant amounts. Money she had given willingly, because she believed at the time it was needed, and because that is what she had been told. She wrote that none of it had been repaid. She wrote the total. I am not going to repeat it here, but I will tell you it was a number that made the house she had left me feel not like a gift, but like an accounting. What I have left you, Mara, is not favoritism. It is a correction. There is a difference. I hope, by the time you read this, you understand which one it is. I sat on my bed for a long time after that. I did not feel triumphant. I felt sad. And I felt seen. Both at once. Margaret requested my records from my grandmother's physician. With the estate now in formal legal proceedings, this was straightforward. What those records showed was uncomplicated. A woman in her late 70s, in declining physical health, with no documented cognitive impairment. Her last cognitive assessment, conducted 3 months before she died, had returned normal results. She had been alert, oriented, and legally competent at the time she had finalized her estate documents. My own records supplemented this. 2 years of visit logs. Dates, times, brief notes. A picture of someone who had shown up, consistently, for reasons that had nothing to do with an inheritance. Margaret looked at the folder when I brought it in and said simply, "Good." When my parents' attorney received the formal response from Margaret's office, something shifted. The contest had opened a discovery window. And in that window, my parents were now required to disclose their financial interactions with my grandmother's estate going back several years. What those records showed was exactly what my grandmother had described in her letter. Financial transfers. Several of them. Over a period of years. Documented, traceable, unreturned. The letter my parents had sent to intimidate me had done the opposite of what they intended. It had given us access to the very evidence that made their case not only unprovable, but, in the context of what my grandmother had written, unjust on its face. My grandmother hadn't just left me something. She had left me a position. And she had spent 2 years making absolutely certain I knew how to stand in it. We did not rush. Margaret spent 2 weeks preparing the formal legal response. I reviewed it with her line by line over the course of 2 meetings at her office. It was, as she described it, a comprehensive and documented rebuttal, which meant every claim they had made was addressed directly, with the corresponding evidence attached. Their claim that my grandmother lacked mental capacity, addressed with her physician's records, her own dated written statement, and the legal documentation signed in the presence of Margaret's firm. Their claim of undue influence, addressed with 2 years of visit logs, character documentation, and, critically, the fact that my grandmother had consulted independently with legal counsel throughout this entire process. Margaret had not been my lawyer first. She had been my grandmother's. My parents had not known that. I remember reading that section of the response and pausing. My grandmother had retained her own attorney. Had done so quietly more than a year before she died. Had made her decisions not in isolation, but with full legal guidance, documented at every step. She had not just written intentions. She had built a wall. The discovery documentation was appended to our response as a separate exhibit. The financial transfers from my grandmother to my parents were laid out plainly. Dates, amounts, purpose as described at the time of transfer. Margaret had drafted a single paragraph that summarized what those records showed without commentary. She didn't need to editorialize. The numbers did that themselves. The inheritance my grandmother had left me was, in total, not significantly larger than what my parents had already received from her over the years and never returned. If anything, it was smaller. My grandmother had not favored me. She had simply stopped covering a debt that had never been acknowledged. Margaret filed the response. We waited. There is a particular quality to waiting when you know you are on solid ground. It is not anxious waiting. It is patient waiting. The kind that has its own rhythm. I went to work. I made coffee. I sat at my kitchen table. I did not check my phone for updates more than once a day. 3 weeks after Margaret filed, her office received a call from my parents' attorney. He wanted to discuss a negotiated resolution. Margaret called me that afternoon. They want to settle, she said. I was quiet for a moment. What does that mean? I asked. It means they've looked at what we filed and they've decided the case isn't winnable. They're looking for a way to exit gracefully. I thought about it for a day. A full day on my own, with no one advising me in either direction. Then I called Margaret back. We don't negotiate, I said. The case is sound. I'm not offering them anything. They can withdraw or they can proceed. Have you ever had a moment where you said something and felt the ground hold completely steady beneath you? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear it. 6 weeks after Margaret filed the formal response, my parents' attorney sent a notice of withdrawal. The contest was dropped. No settlement. No negotiation. They simply withdrew. The estate process moved forward from there. The paperwork took another 2 months. There were things to sign, documents to receive, steps to complete. None of it was difficult. Margaret guided me through it with the same quiet competence she had brought to everything else. On a Tuesday, the same day of the week, which I noticed and which felt like something my grandmother would have appreciated, the house transferred to my name. I drove out to see it that evening. I sat in the driveway for a while. The oaks were bare by then. The windows were dark. It smelled, even from outside with the car window cracked, faintly like cedar. I did not feel like I had won anything. I want to be honest about that. I felt like something had been returned. I did not sell the house. I know that might seem like an obvious decision, but I want you to understand that I thought carefully about it. I thought about whether keeping it was something I was doing out of love, or out of something smaller and less honest than love. In the end, it was simple. My grandmother had wanted me to have it. She had written exactly why. She had built the intention carefully, and she had asked me to hold it. So I did. I've been spending weekends there when I can. There is work to do on the house, small things, the kind that accumulate when a property sits. I've been learning to do some of it myself. There is something about working with your hands in a place that holds someone you loved that settles things. I don't have a better word for it than that. I brought the cedar box back to her house. It seemed right. It sits on the shelf in what was her bedroom, where it always sat. The letter is still inside it. I don't think I'll move it. My parents and I have not spoken. I want to be careful about how I say this, because I don't want to perform either bitterness or false peace. The truth is more ordinary than either of those things. I do not have any plans to reach out. I do not expect them to reach out. The no contact that began 2.5 years ago as a painful decision has, over time, simply become the shape of things. It does not feel like an open wound anymore. It feels like a settled fact. I have a cousin, Rachel, who I am closer to now than I have ever been. I have friends who know the whole story and who have sat with me through the parts that were hard. I have my work, which I am good at and which asks things of me that I find worth giving. I have a house with old oaks and cedar on the shelves. I am, by any honest measure, fine. The house mattered. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But what my grandmother actually gave me was something that the letter formalized but didn't create. She gave me a model. A way of moving through a difficult situation without noise, without performance, without waiting for permission. She had seen something coming. She had prepared for it carefully, quietly, over years. She had not involved me in the preparation because she didn't want the weight of it on me before I needed to carry it. She had simply built the structure and trusted that when the moment arrived, I would know what to do. She didn't fight for me loudly. She built something that would stand on its own. I think about that often. About how much of the most important protection in a person's life is invisible until you need it. About how the people who love you best are sometimes the ones who say the least and do the most, quietly in the background, in the years before the letter arrives. I want to say one more thing before I close, and I want to say it directly to you. I know that not every story has a sealed envelope waiting on a shelf. Not every story has a grandmother who thought 3 steps ahead. Some of you are in the middle of situations that feel like there is no documentation, no lawyer, no structure holding anything in place. I understand that. But I've been thinking since all of this resolved about what my grandmother actually did, stripped of all the legal language and the specific circumstances, and I think what she did was this. She paid attention. She kept records. She found someone competent to help her. And she did not wait until the situation was urgent to start. None of that required extraordinary resources or extraordinary timing. It required patience. It required taking herself seriously enough to prepare. Going quiet, in her case and in mine, was not the same as doing nothing. It was its own kind of work. It was the loudest thing either of us ever did. If you are in a situation right now where you feel overlooked, where you feel like the people who should have seen you have failed to see you, I am not going to tell you what to do. You know your life better than I do. But I will tell you this, your patience, if you choose it, is not passivity. It can be structure. It can be preparation. It can be the thing that holds when someone sends a letter designed to knock you down. Take care of yourselves. Document what matters. Find people you trust. And if this story reached you, if something in it reminded you of your own quiet strength, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs it. Leave a comment. I genuinely read them. I love knowing you're out there. Next week, I'm going to tell you about a woman who sat through a family dinner for 3 hours, said almost nothing, and walked out having changed everything. I'll see you there.